I thought my sister stole my billionaire fiancé, so I married the poorest man in the room. That was my biggest mistake. Because the man I chose, the one everyone ignored, the one standing quietly in the shadows, he wasn't poor. He owns the city. Now I sit here, frozen in a throne I never wanted, staring at my reflection in the glass of a penthouse that feels more like a cage. A single tear slips down my cheek, but I don't move. I can't. Behind me, he stands. Im Jinho. Silent. Still. One hand resting on the back of my chair like he already owns everything I am. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. His presence is enough, cold, heavy, inescapable. Somewhere below us, laughter echoes through the gala. My sister, Lucy, probably wrapped around Finley Anderson, the billionaire I thought was my future, the life I thought I lost. I used to believe she stole everything from me. My future, my crown, my place in the world. But I didn't marry a beggar to get revenge. I married something far worse. And now, I don't know if I chose him, or if he chose me. I wasn't supposed to be here again. The grand ballroom of the Foster estate smelled exactly the same: expensive lilies, heavy perfume, and desperation. For Babirye Tia, the sensation of the silk gown against her skin felt like a ghost's touch. She stood in the center of the swirling gold and white gala, her breath coming in shallow, measured draws. Just moments ago, she had been drowning in the cold reality of a life destroyed by Finley Anderson's debts and cruelty. Now she was back at the beginning, at the very matchmaking gala that had sealed her fate. Across the room, the chandeliers cast a harsh, glittering light on her sister, Lucy. Lucy's red dress was a defiant splash of color against the elegant neutrality of the room. She was preening, her chin tilted at a smug angle as she watched the entrance. Tia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Lucy wasn't just being her usual arrogant self. There was a predatory focus in her eyes that Tia recognized all too well. It was the look of someone who knew exactly where the treasure was buried. Tia, stop staring at nothing. You look like a frightened deer, their mother hissed, adjusting a stray curl on Tia's shoulder with a grip that was far too tight. The Mel Group CEO is about to make his entrance. If you don't land Finley Anderson tonight, the Foster name is finished. Do you understand? Tia didn't answer. She was watching Lucy. Her sister was already moving, carving a path through the crowd with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. The double doors swung open, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Finley Anderson stepped in, radiating the kind of effortless, golden boy charm that had fooled Tia for a decade. He was the billionaire CEO, the prize every woman in the room had been instructed to hunt. In her last life, Tia had been the one to catch his eye. She had walked toward him with a shy smile, believing she was stepping into a fairy tale. But this time, Lucy didn't wait for the introductions. She surged forward, her laughter ringing out like a silver bell as she intercepted Finley before he could even scan the crowd. Mr. Anderson, Lucy purred, her hand sliding onto his arm with practiced ease. I've heard so much about your vision for the city. It's almost as impressive as your presence. Finley's generic, handsome face lit up with a grin. He looked down at Lucy, his eyes dancing with a shallow interest. He showed every shiny new object. And I've heard the Foster sisters were the jewels of the city. I see the rumors were understatements. Tia watched them from a distance, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lucy turned her head back for a fleeting second, catching Tia's gaze. The look in Lucy's eyes was triumphant, a silent declaration of war. I'm taking your crown, Tia. I'm taking the life you used to have. A wave of relief, so powerful it made her knees weak, washed over Tia. Take him, she thought, her lips curving into a ghost of a smile. Take the debt, Lucy. Take the hidden bottles of bourbon, the broken promises, and the cold nights where he'll blame you for his own failures. Take it all. Tia turned her back on the billionaire CEO and the sister who thought she was winning a lottery. She began to walk in the opposite direction, toward the shadows of the service exit. The socialites and heirs ignored her as she moved, her black gown flowing behind her like a trail of ink. They were all focused on the center of the room, on the light, on the fake gold. Standing near the heavy oak doors of the staff corridor was a man who seemed to exist in a different dimension than the rest of the gala. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling out a black suit that was clearly off the rack, a bit too loose in the chest, a bit too long in the sleeves. He held a champagne tray with an air of profound boredom, his sharp, structured face a mask of cold indifference. This was Jinho. In her last life, everyone had called him a penniless loser, a guard who had only gotten into the gala to fill a staff shortage. They had mocked Lucy for being forced into a marriage with him to settle a family debt. Tia remembered seeing her sister cry for weeks, lamenting the shack she had to live in while Tia lived in a mansion. Tia stopped 3 feet away from him. Close up, the guard mask was even more transparent to someone who knew what to look for. His skin was too clear, his posture too dominant, and his eyes, dark, almond-shaped, and lethal, were currently tracking the room with the calculated precision of a general. "You're standing in the shadows, Mr. M," Tia said softly. Her voice was steady, despite the tremor in her soul. "Are you hiding, or are you just waiting for the farce to end?" Jinho didn't move his head, but his eyes shifted to her. For a moment, the air between them grew heavy, the noise of the party fading into a dull roar. The gaze he leveled at her was like low-frequency gravel, rough, deep, and impossibly heavy. "I'm a guard, miss," he said, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. "People like you don't speak to people like me. You're looking in the wrong part of the room for a husband." "I've spent an entire lifetime looking in the right part of the room," Tia replied, stepping closer. The scent of him wasn't the cloying cologne of the elite. It was something metallic, clean, and dangerous. It was remarkably cold. "I've decided I prefer the dark." Jinho finally turned his full attention to her. He set the tray down on a side table with a slow, deliberate movement. The way he looked at her wasn't with the shallow hunger of Finley Anderson. It was the look of a man who was deciding whether to protect something or destroy it. "Careful, Babirye Tia," he whispered, leaning down so only she could hear. "If you choose the poor man, there are no refunds. You don't get to walk away when you find out what's hiding behind the curtains." Tia reached out, her fingers grazing the rough fabric of his cheap sleeve. She felt the rock-hard muscle beneath it, the coiled tension of a man who could burn the room down if he chose to. "I'm not looking for a refund," Tia said, her almond-shaped eyes locking onto his. "I'm looking for the man who is going to help me burn it all down." In the background, she heard the jubilant announcement of Finley Anderson and Lucy's connection, followed by a round of applause. Lucy's smug laughter drifted over the crowd. Tia didn't blink. She kept her eyes on the guard, the man the world ignored, the man who, unknown to everyone but her, held the pulse of the city in his hands. A dark, dangerous smirk tugged at the corner of Jinho's lips. It was the first spark of genuine emotion she had seen on him, and it was terrifyingly beautiful. "Then I suppose we have a deal," he murmured. Tia felt the weight of his gaze, a proprietary, heavy presence that felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. But as she looked at her sister gloating in the distance, Tia knew she hadn't made a mistake. She had traded a fake crown for a real empire, and she was more than ready for the darkness to begin. The neon lights of the city smeared against the rain-slicked windows of the car like melting jewels. Tia sat in the passenger seat of the aging, nondescript sedan, her hands folded tightly over her evening bag. The silence between her and Jinho was absolute, a heavy, pressurized thing that seemed to vibrate with the hum of the engine. She had expected him to take her to the dilapidated outskirts, to some crumbling apartment block where the elevators smelled of rust and broken dreams. That was where he had lived in her previous life, or so she had thought. "We're here," Jinho said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a low-frequency hum. He pulled into the subterranean garage of a building that looked remarkably unremarkable from the street. It was a concrete monolith, tucked between a warehouse and a forgotten office complex. As the heavy steel gate rolled shut behind them with a definitive thud, Tia felt the world outside vanish. Jin-ho led her to a freight elevator. He didn't use a key. Instead, he pressed his palm against a concealed glass panel. A thin line of blue light swept over his skin. Tia watched, her pulse quickening. A simple guard wouldn't have biometric access to a high-security lift. The elevator didn't just move, it glided with a vacuum-sealed hiss, ascending to the top floor in seconds. When the doors opened, Tia braced herself for the scent of dust and cramped quarters. Instead, she stepped into a space that redefined the word apartment. It was a sprawling, open-concept loft, but it felt less like a home and more like an observation deck. The walls were matte charcoal, the floors a seamless expanse of polished obsidian. Minimalist furniture sat like sculptures in the vast space, but what caught her eye were the flickering blue monitors embedded into the walls, displaying scrolling lines of code and thermal camera feeds from the surrounding streets. "You called this a small apartment," Tia murmured, her voice echoing. She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. From this height, the city looked like a circuit board, and she realized they were in one of the highest points in the district, a vantage point for a predator. "It's a place to sleep," Jin-ho replied, tossing his jacket onto a low-slung leather sofa. Without the ill-fitting blazer, his presence was even more suffocating. The white dress shirt strained against the sheer breadth of his shoulders, and the holstered weapon at his side was no longer hidden. Before she could speak, a door at the far end of the loft opened. 3 men stepped out. In the gala's light, she might have mistaken them for the bouncers and drivers Lucy had mocked. But here, stripped of their cheap disguises, the illusion shattered. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, shoulders back, footfalls silent, eyes constantly scanning for threats. They didn't look at Tia with curiosity. They looked at her as if they were calculating the most efficient way to neutralize her. "Don Jin-ho," one of them said, bowing his head slightly. His voice was devoid of emotion, the tone of a man who had long ago scrubbed away his humanity. "The perimeter is set. The Mel Group CEO's movements are being tracked. He's already reached the hotel with your sister." Tia watched the way Jin-ho acknowledged them, a simple, sharp nod that carried the weight of a king's command. These weren't security guards. They were shadows. They were the kind of men who existed in the static between news reports, the ones who made people disappear. One of the men shifted, his sleeve pulling back to reveal a tattoo on his forearm, a silent black phoenix. Tia's breath hitched. She had heard rumors of the Phoenix Corps, an elite unit of assassins whispered to be the personal blade of the city's true ruler. Jin-ho noticed her gaze. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the dark floor. The assassins melted back into the shadows of the hallway as if they had never been there, leaving Tia alone with the man she had chosen. "You're trembling, Tia," he said, stopping just inches from her. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. His skin was cold, but his touch ignited a feverish tension in her blood. "Is the small apartment not to your liking? Or are you finally realizing that the man you married doesn't exist in the light?" Tia looked up at him, forcing herself not to flinch. She saw the reflection of the high-tech monitors in his dark eyes, a digital fire that made him look like something ancient and mechanical. She thought of Lucy, currently trapped in Finley's gilded, debt-ridden cage, believing she had won. Then she looked at the silent killers in the hallway and the fortress Jin-ho had built in the sky. "I didn't choose you because I wanted a comfortable life, Jin-ho," she whispered, her voice gaining a sharp, dangerous edge. "I chose you because I wanted a weapon. And it seems I found a god instead." Jin-ho's eyes darkened, a flash of something that might have been admiration or hunger, flickering in the depths. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over the shell of her ear. "A god can be a very cruel thing to worship, Tia. Don't forget that when the blood starts to spill." He pulled back, his expression returning to that of an unreadable statue. He gestured toward a hallway illuminated by soft, recessed lighting. The master suite is at the end. Sleep while you can. Tomorrow, the city wakes up to a new reality, and your sister will begin to realize exactly what she stole from you. Tia nodded, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. As she walked away, she felt his gaze on her back, a proprietary, heavy weight that told her she was no longer just a woman. She was his. And as she glanced back at the monitors showing the sleeping city below, she knew that for the first time in 2 lives, she was the one holding the power. Even if that power was a monster standing in the dark. The grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious museum was a sea of shifting silk and sharp-edged vanity. This was the annual charity auction, the first public battlefield of the social season. Tia stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the smooth marble railing. She wore a minimalist gown of midnight silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, a stark contrast to the explosive, over-the-top opulence of the room below. Look at her, a familiar, shrill voice drifted up from the floor. She's actually showing her face. Tia looked down to see Lucy, draped in a gown of aggressive gold sequins that practically screamed for attention. Beside her stood Finley, looking every bit the weary billionaire, though Tia could see the subtle tightness in his jaw, the look of a man whose credit lines were beginning to fray. "Tia, darling," Lucy called out, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "I was worried you wouldn't make it. I heard the security guard's salary doesn't usually cover the cost of a valet, let alone an auction paddle." A ripple of cruel laughter moved through the nearby circle of socialites. Tia didn't flinch. She descended the stairs with a slow, regal grace that made Lucy's frantic energy look amateur. Behind her, Jinho followed at a respectful distance. He had returned to his ill-fitting suit and his simple guard mask, but to Tia, the disguise now felt like a predatory crouch. "I didn't come here to compete with you, Lucy," Tia said smoothly as she reached the floor. "I came to support the arts." "Is that what we're calling it?" Lucy smirked, leaning in. "Finley is bidding on the heart of the ocean sapphire tonight. It's valued at 500,000. What are you here for? The leftover hors d'oeuvres?" The auctioneer's gavel cracked, calling the room to order. The air grew heavy with the scent of old money and new greed. Item after item was sold for staggering amounts, but the energy in the room shifted when a small, exquisitely carved jade phoenix was placed on the pedestal. It was a piece Tia had loved in her first life, one Finley had promised to buy her, only to forget his wallet at the last moment. "We'll start the bidding at 50,000, the auctioneer announced. 50,000, Lucy called out immediately, throwing a smug look over her shoulder at Tia. 60, a voice called from the back. 100,000. Lucy shouted, her voice desperate to dominate. She looked at Finley, who shifted uncomfortably. "It matches my eyes, doesn't it, Finley?" Finley forced a smile, though he leaned in to whisper something in her ear. Lucy brushed him off, her eyes locked on Tia. She wanted to see the defeat. She wanted Tia to feel the sting of being the poor sister once again. Tia felt a presence behind her. Jinho's hand didn't touch her, but she felt the heat of him radiating through the silk of her dress. "Do you want it?" he murmured, his voice so low it was felt rather than heard. "I loved it once," Tia whispered. "But she just wants to win." "Then let her see what winning actually costs," Jinho replied. He didn't raise a paddle. He didn't even speak loudly. He simply tapped a button on a small, encrypted device in his pocket. Suddenly, the auctioneer froze. He pressed his hand to his earpiece, his face turning a ghostly shade of pale. He looked toward the back of the room, then at the tablet on his podium. I have a private bid," the auctioneer stammered, his voice trembling. "From an anonymous donor. $10 million. The room went deathly silent. Lucy's hand, still raised with her paddle, began to shake. 10 million? For a jade carving? That's impossible. Who is the bidder? The bidder has requested to remain anonymous, the auctioneer said, his eyes darting toward the shadows where Jinho stood. but the funds have already been verified. And there is a condition. What condition? Finley demanded, his face reddening with embarrassment. The item is to be hand-delivered immediately to Mrs. Babirye Tia, the auctioneer said, as a gift from a man who finds her priceless. The socialites gasped. Lucy's face turned a mottled shade of purple, her sequins shimmering violently as she trembled with rage. Finley looked like he had been slapped, his status as the wealthiest man in the room dissolving in a single sentence. Tia felt the weight of every eye in the room shifting toward her. She turned slightly to look at Jinho. He remained perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but the dark glint in his eyes was unmistakable. He was watching the destruction of Lucy's pride with the cold satisfaction of a wolf watching a trapped rabbit. A courier moved through the crowd, carrying the jade phoenix on a velvet cushion. He bypassed the billionaires and the CEOs, stopping only when he reached Tia. "For you, madam," the courier whispered, bowing low. Tia took the piece, the cool jade smooth against her palm. She looked at Lucy, whose eyes were welling with tears of pure, unadulterated envy. "It seems the guard's salary is more flexible than you thought," Lucy, Tia said, her voice like velvet-wrapped steel. She turned and walked away, Jinho stepping into place behind her. As they exited the ballroom, Tia heard the frantic whispering of the crowd, the rumors starting to catch fire like dry brush. Behind her, she knew the world she once lived in was beginning to crumble, and for the first time, the cage she lived in felt less like a prison and more like a fortress. Finley Anderson's world was a house of cards, and the wind had finally begun to blow. The setting was a private, high-stakes gala hosted at the Anderson estate, an event Finley had organized to project an image of stability to his increasingly nervous investors. The gardens were illuminated by thousands of fairy lights, but the atmosphere was cold. Tia stood near a stone fountain, watching the spectacle. She looked radiant, her skin glowing under the moonlight, the jade phoenix from the auction pinned discreetly to her clutch. She felt a presence behind her, not the suffocating, heavy presence of Jinho, but something more frantic. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Tia turned to see Lucy. Her sister's hair was slightly disheveled, and her expensive silk dress was wrinkled at the waist. Behind her, Finley looked pale, his eyes darting toward a group of men in sharp, dark suits standing by the entrance. They weren't gala guests. They were collectors. "I don't know what you mean, Lucy," Tia said calmly. "The auction. That anonymous bid. You're trying to embarrass us," Lucy hissed. "Finley is the CEO of the Mel Group. He's the king of this city. Your little guard is probably just spending his life savings to make you feel special for one night." Finley stepped forward, trying to reclaim his stature. "Tia, let's be reasonable. If your husband is in over his head, I can help. But this public posturing is beneath you." Before Tia could respond, the men from the entrance approached. The lead collector, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckle, ignored the women entirely and stepped directly into Finley's personal space. "Mr. Anderson," the man said, his voice like grinding stones. "The grace period ended at midnight. You owe $30 million to the offshore accounts and another 15 to the local firms. We aren't here for the champagne." The color drained from Finley's face. I told you, the merger is finalizing. I'll have the liquidity by Monday." "Monday isn't tonight," the collector replied. He looked at Lucy's diamond necklace. "Maybe we start with the jewelry. Or maybe we start with the house." Lucy gasped, clutching her throat. "Finley? What is he talking about? You're a billionaire." "He's a ghost," a new voice rang out. Jinho stepped out from the shadows of a willow tree. He had shed the guard persona entirely. He walked with a slow, predatory confidence that made the collectors, men who feared nothing, immediately stiffen and take a step back. "Don Jinho," the lead collector whispered, his eyes widening in genuine terror. He and his men instantly bowed their heads, their aggressive postures collapsing into total submission. Jinho ignored them, his gaze fixed on Finley. Finley Anderson doesn't own this estate. He doesn't even own the suit he's wearing. Every cent of the Mel Group's capital was leveraged against debts he can't pay. Debts that I now own. Finley's mouth hung open, a pathetic, silent sound escaping his throat. Lucy looked between the bowing collectors and the man she had called a beggar. You, Lucy stammered, her voice cracking. But you're nobody. You're just a guard. Jinho reached Tia's side, his hand sliding firmly onto the small of her back. The touch was dominant, a public claim. I am whatever I need to be to protect what is mine, Jinho said, his eyes cold and lethal. He looked at the collectors. Take everything. Leave them enough for a taxi. My wife and I are finished with this view. As Jinho led Tia away, the screams of Lucy and the desperate pleading of Finley faded into the night. Tia didn't look back. She felt the weight of Jinho's arm around her, a cage, perhaps, but one that had just crushed her enemies under its iron bars. The silence in the penthouse was no longer peaceful. It was a living thing, heavy and watchful. Since the night at the Anderson estate, Tia felt as though the very walls of their home were breathing. Jinho was gone, summoned to a meeting that had left the air in the loft cold, and for the first time, Tia found herself wandering toward the one door that always remained locked. It didn't require a key. As she approached, a hidden sensor recognized the heat of her skin, and the door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Tia stepped inside and felt the air leave her lungs. It was a command center, a cathedral of glass and electricity. One entire wall was composed of high-definition monitors, a flickering mosaic of the city's most private corners. She saw the interior of high-end bank vaults, the private docks of the harbor, and, with a sickening jolt, the living room of her parents' home. She saw Lucy, curled on a tattered sofa, weeping as she clutched a glass of cheap wine. But it wasn't just live feeds. Tables were covered in dossiers, physical files with photos clipped to them. She saw Finley's face, marked with a red X. She saw her own name, Babirye Tia, on a tab at the center of the desk. She opened the folder. Inside were transcriptions of her phone calls from years ago. There were photos of her at the grocery store, at the park, even a blurry shot of her crying at her own wedding in her previous life. I told you once that I see everything, Tia. She spun around. Jinho was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the stark white light of the hallway. He didn't look angry. He looked remarkably calm, as if he had been waiting for her to find this room. You've been watching me, Tia whispered, her voice trembling as she held up a photo of herself from 3 years prior. Even before the gala. Even before I chose you, you were there. Jinho walked into the room, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his eyes like a digital storm. He stopped just inches from her, his presence so massive it seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. I didn't just happen to be at that gala, Tia, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I wasn't testing the room. I was waiting for you. In every timeline, in every life, I have been the shadow behind you. I knew Finley was a fraud before he even met you. I knew Lucy would betray you. He reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of the monitor that showed her sister's miserable apartment. I let it happen, he confessed, his gaze dropping to hers. I let you suffer in that first life because I wanted to see if you would ever look down into the dark and see me. But you never did. So I brought us back. I tilted the board. I made sure this time, the only choice you had left was me. Tia felt a chill crawl up her spine. It wasn't just luck or a miracle of reincarnation. It was an obsession so vast it had bent time itself. She looked at the screens, the entire city was his chessboard, and she realized she wasn't just his wife. She was his prize. You're a monster, she breathed, though she didn't pull away when his hand moved to the back of her neck. I am, Jinho agreed, his thumb grazing her skin with a possessive, heavy pressure. But I am the monster who adores you. I have built a world where no one can ever hurt you again. Not Finley, not Lucy, not even your own blood. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Are you afraid of me now, Tia? Now that you know you didn't stumble into my life, but that I built it around you like a cage. Tia looked at the monitors, at the power he wielded over every soul in the city, and then back into his dark, hungry eyes. She realized that the mistake she thought she had made was deeper than she ever imagined. She hadn't married a man. She had married a force of nature. I'm not afraid, she whispered, her hands gripping his expensive lapels. Because a cage this strong is the only place I've ever felt safe. Jinho's smile was thin and lethal. He turned toward the screens, his hand still anchored to her. Good. Because tomorrow, Lucy is going to try to crawl back. And I want you to watch what I do to her. The air in the penthouse was thick with the scent of rain and the metallic tang of Jinho's expensive cigarettes. Tia stood by the window, watching the city lights, when the elevator chimed. She didn't turn. She knew the rhythm of the house now. But the footsteps that followed weren't the heavy, synchronized strike of Jinho's men. They were uneven, frantic, and clicking with the sound of desperate heels. Lucy stumbled into the living room. Her golden dress was stained, and the smug mask she had worn since the rebirth was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She looked at the obsidian floors and the flickering monitors, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and sudden, ugly greed. Tia, Lucy breathed, her voice cracking. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know your husband was this. What do you want, Lucy? Tia asked, her voice as cold as the glass she was leaning against. Finley is gone. The collectors took everything. They even took my shoes, Tia. I have nothing. Lucy rushed forward, her hands reaching out as if to grab Tia's silk gown. You have to help me. We're sisters. You can't let me live in the gutter while you live like a queen. You chose your king, Lucy. I believe you called him the jackpot. Lucy's face twisted, but she quickly smoothed it over, her eyes darting toward the hallway where Jinho appeared. He had showered, his hair damp and dark, wearing nothing but a black silk robe that hung loosely over his massive frame. He looked like a god of the underworld, terrifying and impossibly beautiful. Lucy's breath hitched. She didn't see a monster, she saw a lifeline. She saw the man she should have stolen instead of Finley. With a sudden, desperate grace, she moved away from Tia and toward Jinho. She let one shoulder of her dress slip, her expression shifting into a pout that had always worked on their father. Mr. M, Lucy whispered, her voice trembling with a forced vulnerability. My sister is so hard-hearted. She doesn't understand what it's like to be a woman alone in this city. I know you're a man of power. A man who knows how to appreciate loyalty. She reached out, her fingers aiming for the lapel of his robe. She was close enough to smell him, the scent of cedar and danger. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, offering him the same shallow devotion she had offered Finley. Jinho didn't move. He didn't flinch. He looked down at her as if she were a curious insect that had crawled into his sanctuary. Loyalty. Jinho's voice was a low, vibrating growl that made the glass in the room hum. Before Lucy's fingers could touch his silk, his hand shot out. He didn't strike her. He caught her by the throat, his grip firm but not crushing, just enough to remind her that her life was a thin thread he held between his fingers. He lifted her slightly, forcing her to stand on her toes, her eyes bulging with sudden, genuine panic. You think I don't remember you, Lucy? Jinho asked, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. I remember the first life. I remember how you laughed when Tia cried. I remember how you called her a loser for marrying a beggar. I watched you mock her from your mansion while she bled in the dark. Lucy tried to speak, but only a wheeze escaped. You didn't want the man, Jinho said, his eyes darkening until they were twin pits of ink. You wanted the throne. And now that the throne is mine, you want to sit on it. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finding Tia across the room. A dark, possessive spark flickered in his eyes. I don't keep trash in my home, Lucy. And I certainly don't share my bed with women who smell like Finley Anderson's failure. He released her abruptly. Lucy collapsed onto the obsidian floor, gasping for air, her golden dress bunched around her like scrap metal. Jinho didn't even look down at her. He walked past her, heading straight for Tia. "Get her out," Jinho commanded. Two of his shadows appeared from the darkness of the hallway. They didn't say a word as they hoisted Lucy up by her arms. "Tia, please," Lucy screamed as they dragged her toward the elevator. "You can't do this. I'm your blood." Tia watched the elevator doors close on her sister's screams. The silence that followed was absolute. She felt Jinho's presence behind her, the heavy, inescapable weight of him. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. His skin was warm, his heart beating a slow, powerful rhythm against her spine. "She's gone, Tia," he murmured into her hair. "Everyone who ever made you feel small is being erased. Are you satisfied?" Tia leaned her head back against his shoulder. She looked at her reflection in the glass, the woman in the throne, the woman who had married the monster. "Not yet," Tia whispered. "We still have the banquet. I want the whole city to see who you are and who I am." Jinho's grip tightened, a low, satisfied chuckle vibrating in his chest. "As you wish, my queen. The world will kneel tomorrow." The night air felt like a physical weight as Tia stepped out of the gallery. She had spent the last hour at a solo event, a deliberate move to show the city she wasn't just Jinho's shadow. But as she waited for the car, the streetlights seemed to flicker, and the familiar, reassuring hum of Jinho's security detail was replaced by a deafening, unnatural silence. Before she could reach for her phone, a van screeched to a halt. Two men, their faces obscured by cheap balaclavas, lunged for her. Tia struggled, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but a rag soaked in a sweet, chemical scent was pressed against her face. The world tilted, the stars above the city blurring into streaks of white before fading into total darkness. When she woke, the air was cold and smelled of damp concrete and old grease. She was tied to a wooden chair in what looked like an abandoned auto shop. Her head throbbed, and her vision was hazy, but a familiar, whining voice brought her back to reality with a jolt. "She's awake." Finally. Tia blinked, her eyes focusing on Finley Anderson. He looked pathetic. His expensive suit was stained, his hair was a bird's nest of grease, and his eyes were bloodshot with a mix of terror and madness. Standing next to him was Lucy, looking equally haggard, her fingers twitching nervously. "Finley, what is this?" Tia asked, her voice raspy. "You've lost your mind." "I lost my empire, Tia. Because of your husband." Finley screamed, pacing the small circle of light. "The collectors are breathing down my neck. They said if I don't get 50 million by tomorrow, I'm a dead man. And since your guard husband seems to have an infinite supply of cash, he's going to pay for your return." Lucy stepped forward, her voice a desperate, high-pitched warble. "We're doing you a favor, Tia. Once he pays, you're free. And we get to start over. It's a win-win." Tia looked at her sister, a cold, hollow pity settling in her chest. "You really think he's going to pay you and let you walk away? You think you've kidnapped a guard's wife?" "He's just a man, Tia," Finley spat, pulling out a burner phone. "A man with a lot of money and a very big ego. I'm going to call him, and I'm going to tell him that if he doesn't drop the cash at the old pier in 1 hour, I'll start sending him pieces of you." Finley dialed the number he had spent a week tracking down. He put it on speaker, his hand shaking so violently the phone nearly slipped. The line picked up on the first ring. There was no hello, no sound of breathing. Just a silence so absolute it felt like the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. "I have her," Finley shouted into the phone, his voice cracking. "I have your wife, you broke piece of trash. 50 million. The old pier. 1 hour. Or she dies." There was a long pause. When Jinho finally spoke, his voice didn't sound like a human's. It was a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the very floorboards beneath them. "Finley Anderson," Jinho said, his tone impossibly calm. I gave you the mercy of poverty. I let you keep your life. That was my only mistake. Shut up. Do you hear me? 50 million. I don't pay ransoms for what already belongs to me, Jinho replied. And you aren't talking to a guard anymore. You're talking to a man who is currently watching you through a thermal scope from the building across the street. Finley froze. Lucy let out a small, strangled whimper. Look at the red dot on your chest, Finley. Jinho's voice continued, silk-wrapped and lethal. It's currently resting over your heart. If you move your hand toward Tia, the last thing you will ever hear is the sound of your own ribs shattering. Finley looked down. A tiny, steady crimson dot was dancing on his white shirt. He let out a sob, the phone clattering to the floor. I didn't bring money, Finley. Jinho's voice echoed from the discarded phone. I brought an army. And unlike you, I don't make deals with ghosts. Suddenly, the windows of the warehouse shattered inward. Black-clad figures swarmed through the openings like shadows come to life. Finley and Lucy didn't even have time to scream before they were pinned to the floor, the cold barrels of suppressed rifles pressed against their skulls. The heavy steel door of the warehouse groaned as it was ripped open. Jinho walked in, his black overcoat billowing behind him. He didn't look at the prisoners. He didn't look at the men holding the rifles. He walked straight to Tia, his expression a mask of cold, concentrated fury. He knelt in front of her, his large hands untying the ropes with a terrifyingly controlled precision. Once she was free, he didn't pull her into a hug. He gripped her chin, forcing her to look into his eyes that were no longer human, but twin pits of dark, ancient hunger. Did they touch you? He whispered, his voice trembling with the effort of not killing everyone in the room. No, Tia replied, her voice steady. They were too busy being afraid. Jinho stood up, pulling her to her feet and tucking her securely under his arm. He finally turned his gaze to Finley and Lucy, who were sobbing on the floor. Don Jinho, please. Lucy wailed. She's my sister. I didn't mean it. Finley made me do it. Jinho looked at his lead assassin, the man with the black phoenix tattoo. I want them kept alive. For now. I want them to see the banquet tomorrow. I want them to see the world they lost, and I want them to know exactly what it feels like to be hunted by someone who never stops. He turned Tia away, leading her toward the exit. As they stepped out into the night, the sound of black SUVs idling filled the air. The mistake wasn't yours, Tia, Jinho murmured as he slid her into the back of the armored car. It was theirs. They thought I was a man who followed the rules. Tomorrow, the city learns that I am the rule. The grand hall of the Moretti estate was a vision of terrifying elegance. Tonight was the Black Tie and Shadows banquet, an event so exclusive that the city's elite had spent months bribing officials just for a glimpse at the guest list. They were all there, the old money families, the tech moguls, and the corrupt politicians, all whispering about the mysterious host who had systematically dismantled the Mel Group in a single week. At the far end of the hall, two figures were displayed like cautionary tales. Finley and Lucy sat at a small, isolated table near the service entrance, shackled to their chairs by invisible threats. They were dressed in the rags they had been kidnapped in, their faces pale and hollowed by terror. To the guests, they looked like a piece of performance art. To Finley and Lucy, the room felt like a gallows. The double doors at the head of the ballroom swung open. The room fell into a silence so profound you could hear the flicker of the candle flames. Babirye Tia entered first. She was a vision of absolute sovereignty, draped in a gown of hand-stitched obsidian lace that seemed to absorb the light. The jade phoenix was pinned to her waist, and her high cheekbones glowed under the cinematic gold of the chandeliers. She didn't walk, she glided, her expression a mask of dawning realization and hidden strength. And behind her stood the man the city had whispered about for decades, but never seen. Jinho had finally shed the cheap suits and the slouch of a guard. He wore a tuxedo tailored with razor-sharp precision, his styled black hair framing a face that was cold, structured, and undeniably dominant. The Mafia Don aura was no longer a secret. It was a physical force that made the men in the room lower their eyes and the women hold their breath. As they reached the center of the floor, the lead assassin with the black phoenix tattoo stepped forward and dropped to one knee. Within seconds, every security guard in the room, every waiter, and half of the prominent businessmen followed suit. The sound of 100 knees hitting the marble echoed like a gunshot. Don Jinho, they chanted in a low, rhythmic unison. Jinho didn't acknowledge them. He turned to Tia, his hand sliding firmly onto the small of her back, a proprietary claim that signaled to the world who she was. He then looked toward the service table where Lucy and Finley sat trembling. Lucy, Jinho's voice rang out, low and vibrating with a lethal clarity. You once asked why Tia would choose a broke guard over a billionaire. Look around you. He gestured to the room of kneeling titans. You stole a man who built his house on sand, Jinho said, his eyes locking onto Lucy's with a predatory chill. Tia chose the man who owns the ground the house was built on. She didn't settle. She ascended. Lucy let out a broken, jagged sob, her eyes darting from the magnificent woman her sister had become to the pathetic, shaking fraud sitting next to her. Finley tried to speak, to beg, but a sharp look from a nearby guard silenced him instantly. Tonight, Jinho continued, addressing the room but never taking his eyes off Tia, is not just a banquet. It is a coronation. The Foster family is dead. Finley Anderson is a memory. From this moment on, the city answers to the Queen. He reached out, his thumb grazing Tia's jawline, his gaze hungry and possessive. In that moment, the big mistake was fully realized not by Tia, but by everyone who had ever doubted her. She wasn't just safe, she was the most powerful woman in the hemisphere. Tia looked at her sister one last time, not with hatred, but with a cold, regal indifference. Then, she turned her back on the past and looked up at her husband. Let the banquet begin, she whispered. The aftermath of the reveal hung over the grand hall like the silence after a storm. The elite guests remained frozen, their champagne flutes forgotten, as they watched the final transition of power. Babirye Tia didn't look at them. She looked at the two figures being dragged toward the center of the floor by Jinho's silent, shadow-like enforcers. Finley and Lucy were no longer the winners of the social season. They were ghosts of a life Tia had already lived and rejected. Finley's face was a map of broken veins and desperate tears, while Lucy's golden dress was torn, her hair matted against her forehead. You took everything, Lucy wheezed, her voice barely a whisper as she looked up at Tia. You always win. In the last life and in this one. It's not fair. Tia stepped forward, the obsidian lace of her gown whispering against the marble. She leaned down, her almond-shaped eyes filled not with the anger Lucy expected, but with a cold, devastating pity. You had the same chance I did, Lucy, Tia said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. We both woke up with the memories of our mistakes. You chose to chase the same shallow gold that broke me before. I chose to look for the soul beneath the rags. You didn't lose because of me. You lost because you still haven't learned that a crown is just a piece of metal if the man wearing it has no heart. Jinho stepped up behind Tia, his massive hand coming to rest on her shoulder. The gesture was no longer just a claim, it was a shield. He looked at the lead enforcer. Take them to the docks, Jinho commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. Finley Anderson's debts are still active in the underworld. Let him work them off in the cargo ships. And Lucy? Send her back to our parents' house. Remove the doors, the mirrors, and the electronics. Let her live in the silence of her own greed until she forgets the sound of my wife's name. As the villains were hauled away, their screams fading into the night, Jinho turned Tia to face him. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a ring, not a diamond, but a heavy, intricate band of black gold set with a single, flawless ruby that looked like a drop of dragon's blood. He slid it onto her finger, over the jade phoenix ring. The city is yours, Tia, he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. Every light you see from that penthouse, every shadow in the alleyways, it all belongs to the queen. Are you ready to roll the dark? Tia looked around the room. The billionaires were still bowing. The politicians were waiting for her nod to speak. She felt the weight of the ruby on her finger, a cage, a fortress, and a throne all at once. She looked into Jinho's eyes, seeing the man who had bent time itself just to hear her say his name. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore, Jinho," she whispered, her hands sliding up to his sharp jawline. "I'm the one who controls it." She leaned in, and as they kissed, the ballroom erupted into a final, rhythmic chant of loyalty. The big mistake was over. The coronation was complete. In a world of fake billionaires and treacherous sisters, the black woman who married the broke guard had finally found the only thing worth owning, an empire built on a love that was as lethal as it was eternal. The foster name was gone. The nightmare was over. The era of the Mafia Queen had begun.